Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library, and I have a great story to tell you. Since the dawn of human culture, men have looked at the sky and observed all these mysterious celestial bodies that keep coming back every night and seem to follow patterns. Groups of stars apparently travel together and return to the same position each year. They rose and disappeared each day with the moon, following its own cycle of 28 days, and other bodies like planets or comets. But what were these? Were they shiny beings living in the skies? Or were they gems embedded in a celestial dome? And why did they move? It also appeared that the cycles of these objects in the sky corresponded to seasons and their weather patterns. Did that mean what happened on Earth was reflected in the sky? Or the other way around, that the movement of celestial bodies influenced or determined what took place in our world? These are certainly some of the observations and questions that gave rise to both astronomy, the study of celestial objects, and astrology, the attempt to discern and predict information about human affairs and terrestrial events based on their apparent position of celestial objects. Actually, we will see that in many cultures around the world, astronomy and astrology were not formally separated until major breakthroughs in astronomy in modern times, starting in the 16th and 17th centuries, when it appeared that Earth was maybe not the center of the universe, and that all the stars and planets that seemed to fly around it were, in fact, other bodies following their own course in space. Astrology did not disappear, it adapted, but lost its status as a science or academic discipline, at least in Western countries, and became one of many esoteric practices with a certain popular success, especially since the 20th century, when it had a resurgence in the media, and undeniably it has an appeal. So tonight, I will tell you about the long and sometimes surprising history of astrology. We will see the different forms this discipline took in various cultures and how they evolved with discoveries. We will explore how Western astrology, with its zodiac signs and concepts, formed, and also a few hypotheses about why so many people are drawn to it, even though they are sometimes skeptical about its predictive value. This story is not going to be about whether astrology works or doesn't work. We're going to look at it from a historical and cultural point of view. But first, I would like to let you know that we have a Patreon page for those of you who wish to and can support this project, get more of it, and listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Patreon is a platform that allows you to contribute directly to our work financially. Our least expensive tier is $3 per month, but it doesn't mean you will get less. We let people contribute what they wish to or can, and everyone gets everything that is on our page, because the world is a better place when the sun shines for everyone. You will gain access to several exclusive stories and also to all our episodes with and without background sounds. We offer advance releases to our patrons as well. We have added links to Patreon as well as links to different streaming options which may be better suited for you. You will find a link in the description of the episode, along with timestamps that allow you to resume the episode wherever you left off, in case you do fall asleep. But before we begin, if you wish to, you may close your eyes and allow yourself to forget about any worries as we embark on this adventure together. Now assume a comfortable position. Maybe move a little bit to settle. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath, and when you slowly exhale, feel your shoulders drop. Release the tension in your neck. Let your face soften and your jaw relax. Make sure your fingers are not clenched and that your legs are relaxed too. And allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. And now it's time to explore. It's hard to know exactly when predictions began to be made using the position and movement of stars and planets, but it certainly started with the observation of cycles in the sky. The earliest evidence we have of an interest in the cycles of celestial objects dates back to 25,000 years ago. Markings on bones and the prehistoric cave walls that tracked lunar cycles are probably the most obvious kind of cycle because they are relatively short, 28 days only, and the moon is often the most visible body in the night sky. Humans could certainly notice the connection between these movements and natural phenomena, like tides for the moon, or the connection between seasons and their weather patterns with how high the sun rose in the sky. We ignore the meaning attributed to these patterns so long ago, if any. But these basic astronomical observations became particularly useful when human groups settled and adapted a sedentary lifestyle based on agriculture. This happened during the Neolithic agricultural revolution, which took place in different parts of the world more than 10,000 years ago. More and more groups transitioned from hunting and gathering to a life of settlement and agriculture based on the domestication of plants that became crops and of animals. Agriculture implies planning. You need to know what time of the year is appropriate to plant seeds, and depending on the regions, you need to anticipate recurring phenomena like rain or floods to take advantage of them. This made astronomy a useful tool. Constellations of stars in particular that follow annual cycles in the sky through annual floods or seasonal activities. By the 3rd millennium BC, when urban civilizations emerged, they had developed an awareness of celestial cycles, of everything visible to the naked eye, and established the correspondence between these cycles and the seasons, the years, or the probability of weather events, such as variations in temperature or rain. There was this practical dimension to it, but because we are also beings of culture and symbols of interpretation, casual links were established. We have proof of that. For example, in the alignment of temples with the rising of stars or the position of certain bodies in the sky at pivotal moments in the year. Very old monuments, from Stonehenge to Egyptian pyramids or Sumerian temples, were not built randomly. Their orientation and perhaps their architecture were filled with significance, with meaning, as if they were conceived as meeting points between our terrestrial world and what was above it. This tells us that the movement of celestial bodies was seen as much more than just practical information. It was also infused with meaning. Saying what meaning exactly is tricky. For the very first civilizations, we can only speculate because they did not leave explicit documents about their views, only ruins and scattered inscriptions sometimes. The connection between what happened in the sky, repeating fixed cycles, and terrestrial phenomena like seasons was obvious, and this probably explains why astrological beliefs appeared spontaneously, it seems, across the world in cultures that were not in contact. These cultures elaborated astrological systems that were all different and sometimes contradictory. The same body, like a planet, could be attributed different influences or functions. But in parts of the world that were far apart, these systems emerged and became used for divination to understand the present or anticipate the future. If celestial bodies were connected to terrestrial life, and we can anticipate the cycles of these bodies, then why not also study their possible influence and use it to make predictions about events, from people's lives to entire societies? Astrological systems can be very different, but this is their common starting point: the assumption or belief that celestial objects determine or influence what happens on Earth and will continue to do so in the future. The earliest recorded organized system of astrology is Babylonian astrology, which arose in the second millennium BC in Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq. It is the first recorded system or theory of astrology. But obviously, this doesn't mean it did not exist before. We know that 1,000 years earlier, in the same region, the Sumerians made omens inspired by celestial observation. But references to these are isolated, and there is not sufficient information to figure out what the Sumerians thought of astrology and how it was practiced. However, from the Babylonians of the second millennium BC, we have some written information, including a comprehensive compilation of 70 tablets comprising thousands of celestial omens. This form of astrology, as it appears in the tablets, was focused on practical predictions concerning mundane topics like weather forecasts or political forecasts. So, astrology in Babylon was used to make predictions and served as a very practical tool to establish yearly calendars for communities with a list of the tasks they should accomplish at each moment of the year, such as harvesting, fishing, sowing crops, collecting or managing water reserves, things like that. It seems there was no clear distinction between the predictive function of astrology and the yearly calendar, which is more of a timekeeping, very practical. The Babylonians were limited in their astronomical knowledge, which was not the most advanced of their time. It was 1,000 years later, in the 5th and 4th centuries, that they started accurately calculating and predicting future planetary positions for planets that were visible to the naked eye, obviously, such as Jupiter, Venus, Mars, or Mercury. Saturn was also known at this time. At this point, they started producing ephemerides, that is to say, diaries or books, but they were on tablets, not on paper, and they gave the future trajectory of astronomical objects. Ephemerides were crucial to making elaborate astrological predictions, to know where planets were in the past when a person was born or an event happened, and to be able to anticipate where planets would be at a given time in the future. It is believed that the Babylonians associated planets with their gods and saw astrology as a way to understand or anticipate what divine forces would expect from them and how to please or appease them. With the multiplication of ephemerides, their astrology also became more individualized, with predictions about people and no longer just meteorological trends or predictions about politics and the whole of society. They started making horoscopes, which means a visual representation of the heavens at a given time. And with them came natal astrology, the concept that remains central in modern Western astrology, that an individual's personality or path of life can be explained and anticipated, at least in part, depending on the situation of the sky at the moment of the person's birth. This belief that astrology can make predictions about individuals and not just social, political, or meteorological events was also present in ancient Indian and Chinese astrology. But as we see with the case of the Babylonians, it appeared after the creation of an astrological system, at least a millennium later in the case of Babylon. They didn't have enough astronomical knowledge to establish horoscopes and birth charts before the 5th century BC. Babylon also established, in the first half of the first millennium BC, the tradition of dividing the sky into zodiac signs named after constellations. The mapping of the visible sky happened before and in various parts of the world. For example, we know from Egyptian tombs that the Egyptians, from the 2nd millennium BC, had already divided the night sky into segments, or decans. They had 36 of them, and they were identified by the group of stars that appeared inside each of them, providing a background in the sky, slowly moving along the year against which faster bodies, like planets, moved. These segments are called decans because they are 10 degrees wide. So with 36 of them, that's 360 degrees in total, representing the entire landscape of the sky that passed above them during a year. To the Egyptians, these decans were like a coordinate system. When something was observed in the sky, they could note, record, and communicate the information. The Babylonians also had maps of the sky, but by the 5th or 4th century BC, they divided the visible celestial sphere into 12 sections, each of 30 degrees, like the 12 months of the year. They attributed and assigned each section to a particular sign as they developed birth charts and horoscopes. And so, from an astrological standpoint, people were born under a particular sign depending on the position of the sun in the visible sky, the ecliptic, at the moment of their births. This sign, along with the individual positions of planets within the zodiac at the time of birth, provided as many individualized influences as possible that could explain a person's personality or destiny. As you see, many principles of Western astrology were elaborated and invented by the Babylonians. They then traveled to the Greco-Roman world to the west and to India to the east. I will tell you later about Indian astrology, but before that, let's look at what happened in the Mediterranean, more specifically in Egypt. By the end of the 6th century BC, the Babylonians conquered Egypt, which at this point was well past its glorious days of independence and stability. But Egypt was still rich. It had a large population and a vibrant culture. Part of this culture was its astrological tradition. We don't know in detail how the Egyptian astrological system worked, but astrologers were present. The ecliptic had been mapped into sections, known as decans, that I just mentioned, and astrology was used as a divination method, for example, before battles, or to name newborns from the aristocracy. Astrologers in Egypt had been consulted for centuries. It is believed that this Babylonian occupation greatly influenced Egyptian astrology, even though it didn't last very long. For example, in the naming of the zodiac signs, it left a significant trace. 200 years later, Alexander the Great invaded Egypt, taking it from the Persians, who had replaced the Babylonians. Egypt became the place where different great cultures, different and big influences mixed the most: Egyptian, Babylonian, Persian, Greek. When it came to astrology, a synthesis emerged that included the Babylonian tradition of zodiac signs named after constellations, the Egyptian tradition of subdividing the ecliptic into 26 sections of 10 degrees, which cut each zodiac sign into 3 subsections, 3 decans, and the significance that the Greeks had given to the various planets they knew. These different takes on astrology merged and formed the basis of Western astrology. In the 2nd century AD, they were synthesized in a book by a scholar called Claudius Ptolemy, who was at the same time a mathematician, astronomer, astrologer, and geographer. This book, the Tetrabiblos, was translated from Greek to Arabic, which ensured its preservation, then to Latin during the Middle Ages, almost 1,000 years after it had been written, and it became a kind of Bible, the main reference for European astrologers for centuries. As in many other cultural and intellectual fields, Greek influenced Rome. In the first centuries of our era, the kind of astrology that dominated around the Mediterranean was this synthesis of Babylonian, Egyptian, and Greek beliefs. It was still different from modern Western astrology because fewer planets were known, and the calculations of their positions were less precise than they would become. But overall, The concepts of zodiac signs named after constellations, the belief that someone's astrological profile depended on the time and place of birth in relation to the positions of astronomical objects, all of this was already in place. Both Greek and Roman societies had an ambivalent view of astrology. It was popular, as were many means of divination, though probably not as much as oracles. But in the lower classes of society that did not have access to oracles or seers, astrology could work as a substitute. It made its way up in society, and some Roman emperors started to consult astrologers for guidance. But it doesn't mean astrology was always embraced. It was also criticized. First, because it remained seen as a foreign practice, especially by the Romans. They knew it came from the East, but it was not genuinely Roman. And there was an ongoing concern among the Roman elite about the possible contamination or decline of Roman identity due to foreign influences. Even though the Romans tolerated foreign gods, beliefs, and languages, most educated Romans of the first or second centuries saw their culture, political tradition, military, and social order as superior to nothing else. And why wouldn't they, since they had been very successful? But as their empire expanded and Roman citizens multiplied, there was always the fear that what made Rome strong could be diluted and become decadent, that the values of bravery, sacrifice, honor, high morality, or efficacy that were seen as inherently Roman would get lost. So even at the height of Roman power and influence, there were authors condemning foreign influences of all kinds, from the importation of exotic luxury goods suspected of softening the Romans to alien religious beliefs or practices like astrology. Astrology was still associated with Babylon and Egypt. It was referred to as Chaldean wisdom, Chaldea being the name given to Babylonia, to Mesopotamia. Astrologers were sometimes attacked in writings and called charlatans. The main argument used against them was that there was no proof that what they said was accurate. Greeks and Romans did not have something comparable to the modern scientific method, but they distinguished between analogical and deductive reasoning. Astrology was, and still is, analogical, which means it works purely on comparisons, but cannot explain why it works. Astrologers claim that having a planet in a particular position at birth or at a given moment had a certain influence, but they could not explain how or why. They could only say it was as it was because it had been observed before. There is no logical deductive relation here, and different Roman thinkers pointed this out, arguing that they were asked to believe something said by someone, could not even explain it or prove evidence that it had been observed. Maybe it was just made up after all. The same thinkers could accept unproven beliefs when they were part of their own cultural traditions, but not from some alien culture that they considered somewhat decadent. The same arguments for or against astrology are still around. Astrology lost its recognition as a science because it cannot explain how or why it would work, and it cannot demonstrate that it statistically works. This is why we can speak of analogical reasoning here, a belief that an observation implies an effect exists without an understanding of how the two are related. This is what superstitions are made of. A very basic example of analogical reasoning could be, I have observed that it rained during the past 3 Fridays, so that must mean that Fridays bring rain. But before we judge, we also need to acknowledge that analogical reasoning plays a big role in human thought processes. It is because we make comparisons and start from observation that we can elaborate hypotheses, and that helps us to navigate daily events without necessarily deeply understanding everything that happens around us. We absolutely need analogies. Another analogy, for example, could be that when there are clouds, rain follows. And this one is a fruitful analogy, the first step towards understanding where rain comes from. So, without the analogical thought process, without the capability to make that kind of comparison, we would have a hard time making hypotheses and questioning them. But still, analogical reasoning is generally less convincing than deductive reasoning. That is to say, a form of reasoning that is able to logically explain why and how things happen as they do. A contemporary reaction to this argumentative weakness of astrology is to speak of supposed energies sent by celestial bodies that would reach us and provide this logical link between planets or celestial configurations and our state of mind or circumstances. This concept of energies provides the causality, but maybe not a very convincing one, because the term energy here is still undefined. It is not energy in the sense of physics. It was never measured or quantified. It is seen as immaterial. It is more a synonym for influence that sounds a bit more scientific or tangible than the term influence. But it is still purely conceptual. No one has ever explained or measured what this supposed energy was, or how astrology was able to anticipate it. Even though they were not formulated in scientific terms, these objections to astrology were already raised 2,000 years ago. That being said, beware of thinking that these anti-astrology of Roman authors were rigorous scientists, in the case of most of them like Cicero. But there were many others. It seems their opposition to astrology was much more motivated by a visceral rejection of a foreign practice that bothered them, rather than by a love of logic and science. At the same time, they also defended Roman beliefs and traditions that were not rooted in logic and reasoning at all. But in practice, this didn't stop astrology from spreading and appealing to all social classes. Remember that at the time, astrology and astronomy were not clearly separated fields. As a matter of fact, many scholars did both, and this tells us that there was no widespread rejection of astrology by the scholarly world. Like for alchemy and chemistry, alchemy being the more esoteric ancestor of scientific chemistry. Astrology and astronomy were hard to distinguish and they probably mutually stimulated each other. Demand for astrology gave an incentive to develop better calculations of the movement of celestial objects. It also stimulated the elaboration of theories about the nature of the cosmos and this mysterious dome above people's heads. In that sense, the concern for astrology was certainly fruitful in terms of discoveries upon which future generations would build. The absence of clear separation between astronomy and astrology continued until the dawn of modern times, including in universities, until astronomy eventually separated itself from astrology when it appeared that Earth was maybe not the center of the universe, and the mapping of the sky and the hypotheses medieval astrology was built on were challenged by a completely different representation of the world, in which Earth was also a body traveling in space like all other planets and stars we can see. But we will come back to this. Before I tell you about astrology in the Middle Ages, let's go back east and to America to see how different astrological systems emerged in China, India, or Mesoamerica. As all these developments took place in the Middle East, the Mediterranean, another region of the world where astronomy and astrology experienced advanced development was in China. Chinese astrology was elaborated in the first millennium BC, around the same time as the Babylonian, Egyptian, and Greek syntheses, which happened 2,000 years ago. Several principles were set in China that are quite different from Western astrology. First, because Chinese astrology was infused with traditional principles and beliefs from Chinese culture, such as yin-yang philosophy, that is to say, the belief in two opposite and complementary principles, the theory of the five elements, metal, wood, water, fire, and earth, or the concept of heaven and earth. The Chinese also associated the planets they knew with elements, not with deities like the Greco-Roman world. Venus was associated with metal, Jupiter with wood, Mercury with water, Mars with fire, and Saturn with earth. Chinese astrology was and still is based on the mapping of the sky, but the constellations are different. And there are not the same zodiac signs that divide the year into 12 segments. Instead, Chinese astronomers divided the celestial circle into 12 sections, following the orbit of Jupiter. Jupiter takes about 12 years to complete a revolution around the Sun, so 12 years, in reality a bit less, is the iteration of a year for Jupiter. So Chinese zodiac signs are associated with periods of 1 year and are different from Western zodiac signs, such as the dragon, tiger, horse, and monkey. Although the system is quite different, but Chinese astrology had the same functions as its Western counterpart. There was mundane astrology that told of seasons and events impacting society, similar to what was practiced in Babylon that we talked about, all the way to birth astrology, with the same belief that a person's fate and character could be influenced by the position of the major planets at their birth, along with the position of the sun, the moon, the place of birth, their zodiac sign, which in that case determined by the year of birth rather than a division of the year. Interestingly, the division of the sky into segments occurs spontaneously in various parts of the world. Among cultures that were not in contact, we also see it in Mesoamerica. As you may know, Mesoamerican cultures like the Maya, the Olmecs, the Toltecs, the Aztecs had advanced astronomical knowledge. In the first millennium BC, they had identified and rather precisely estimated the solar year. They could also anticipate the course of planets and had elaborate calendars. If we take the Maya as an example, they had a solar calendar of 360 days that is believed to have been essentially practical. It was used for the planting of crops and other domestic matters. They also had a ritual or religious calendar of 260 days. It was shorter. And this one governed rites, ceremonies, offerings to their gods, and festivals. They also tracked the cycle of Venus, a 584-day cycle, which followed the course of Venus. To the Greeks and Romans, because Venus had been associated with the goddess of love and beauty, the planet was generally seen as a positive astrological influence, or at least one that governed intimate feelings and love life. To the Maya, Venus was much more sinister in a sense. It was believed to be inauspicious and a bringer of violence. So the rising of Venus at the beginning of this 584-day cycle would be preferentially chosen to start wars or engage in confrontation in general. The Maya also named constellations after animals. They are not all known, but it seems at least some of their constellations were common with other separate cultures, like the constellation of Gemini, that they called Bikari, or Scorpio, that they also called the Scorpion. Yet another major region in the world that developed an astronomical system was India. India was influenced by and also influenced Mesopotamia and China. India was another place of astronomical excellence in the ancient world, and astrology built on this. The origins and influences that led to modern Indian astrology are a bit unclear, because a lot of texts from the first centuries of our era got lost. The first known astrology text in Sanskrit is from the 2nd century AD, and it was translated from Greek. Indeed, many aspects of Indian astrology retain traces of this Greek influence. There are the same zodiac signs, each associated with one of the 4 elements, for example. However, there are also other concepts that appear to be specifically Indian. For example, on top of the 12 zodiac signs, the sky is also divided into 27 segments called lunar mansions. The system also considers 9 celestial bodies, but they are not exactly the same as in Western astrology. After the discovery of new planets that were not visible without telescopes, Western astrology updated its system. Typically, it included Uranus, Neptune, and sometimes dwarf planets like Ceres. The Indian system focuses on planets that have been known for thousands of years: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, plus the Sun and the Moon, which account for 3. There is the whole body, but also its south node and its north node. Node here refers to the position of the moon in its cycle. The north node is when the moon is rising for half of the lunar month, and the south node is the aspect of the moon when it is descending. The body of Indian astrology, as it is in use today, was fixed in text from the early medieval period, the 6th to 8th centuries AD. At the same time, to the west of India, Middle Eastern and Greek astrology were adopted by Islamic scholars. So let's take a look at that too. As soon as the expansion of Islam began in the 7th century, Arab scholars, who most of the time knew Greek, began to translate and circulate Greek and Latin writings in every field, including astronomy and astrology. They expanded this knowledge from antiquity. For example, in the field of astronomy, they identified and named many stars. Many stars have names that come from Arabic, like Aldebaran, Altair, Betelgeuse, or Vega, and they also applied their mathematical skills to astrology. For example, they developed a calculation of angles between celestial bodies and included them in horoscopes. Astrology in the medieval Islamic world was very well established. Monarchs would consult astrologers, and the discipline had its place in libraries and universities. But this doesn't mean astrology was accepted by everyone. Here again, several prominent astronomers, mathematicians, or thinkers wrote against it for different reasons. One reason was the old objection to astrology that already existed centuries earlier about its purely empirical nature. Astrologers claimed that a given celestial configuration would produce certain effects, but they could not explain why or how they knew it. There had been no experiment, no proof, and some authors argued that it could be completely invented. Interestingly, the idea that the planets and other bodies acted on terrestrial life was not really discussed or argued against. It was admitted as something likely. What these authors attacked, like Avicenna, one of the most prominent philosophers of medieval Islam, who was also a physician and believed in proof-based knowledge, they contested or doubted the capability of astrologers to determine the exact influence of stars and planets. Avicenna believed that astrologers knew nothing and just repeated what others had invented before them, taking it as knowledge when in fact it had been made up. So Avicenna and others did not deny the essential dogma of astrology, the belief that celestial bodies have an influence on human life. What he denied was our ability to make predictions from astrology. Another kind of critique was more of a theological nature. Orthodox Islamic scholars argued that the will of God could not be precisely known or predicted in advance when it came to the lives of individuals or small groups, and that it was arrogant, almost blasphemous, to pretend to be able to predict the future. We will see in a minute that a similar argument also existed in Christianity. The Catholic Church rejected astrology. But in Muslim regions during the Middle Ages, these critiques were around, and astrology was a bit controversial. However, because it remained closely associated with astronomy and was also used to make meteorological forecasts or even in medicine, it was considered by many as part of the natural sciences of the time. And apart from these theoretical debates, the point is that there was demand and fascination for astrology. It was popular, so it was abundantly practiced and written about. At the same time, in medieval Europe, which was predominantly Christian, and more as the Middle Ages advanced, astrology continued marginally in the first centuries of the Middle Ages because antique astronomical knowledge had been lost in this part of the world. The intellectual and scholarly world was very fragmented, so it is likely that astrology was still practiced by a few people, but probably in an unsophisticated form. Another factor that didn't favor astrology was that the church condemned it as a superstition. In practice, it was not repressed or aggressively fought. Few astrologers were rarely bothered by the church unless they became vocal about other theories or beliefs seen as heretical. In that case, the practice of astrology could be held against them as a sign of deviance or blasphemy. So while the church was hostile, it didn't stop astrology from existing and even prospering as the Middle Ages advanced. In the 12th and 13th centuries, different texts were translated from Arabic, ancient Greek treatises, or the writings of Muslim astrologers and astronomers who had built upon them. This was not limited to astrology, rather, in many other fields, Arabic manuscripts or Greek manuscripts from Byzantium allowed medieval Europe to rediscover and reappropriate antique science, philosophy, and antique beliefs too. As the first European universities were established after the 10th century, astrology, which was paired with astronomy, became one of the areas taught at the same level as arithmetic, geometry, or rhetoric. We have plenty of signs that astrology was very present in medieval culture, from the educated to modest classes. For example, medieval writers often used astrological symbolism with zodiac signs and planets in their literary themes. Many of them speak of astrology in a way that assumes a certain knowledge of their readers about it. We also have the precious archives of a 15th century English astrologer, Richard Trewithion, which include a notebook listing his clients. This list shows people from all walks of life, not just wealthy or educated individuals, suggesting that consulting with an astrologer was a widespread practice by the end of the Middle Ages. One field where astrology played a significant role was medicine. By the 13th century, using astrology was a part of everyday medical practice in Christian Europe. To become a physician with official recognition, one had to know enough astrology to use the position of stars, planets, and the moon as important information in a diagnosis or to decide on a treatment. By the 1500s, it was even compulsory in many countries to calculate the position of the moon before any complicated procedure like surgery. These procedures had to be done at the right time with the right celestial influences on the patient's side. Maybe the peak of European astrology was in the 16th century, at the time of the Renaissance. Coming out of the Middle Ages, astrology had a high profile already. Astronomical knowledge from the Roman antiquity had been fully recovered and even perfected, and astrology benefited from its association with astronomy, which gave it a veneer of fact-based, credible science. At the time, all the kings or high aristocrats, powerful people, consulted astrologers. Ephemerides and horoscopes were widely distributed using the printing press, reaching more people than ever. This was the century of Nostradamus. Nostradamus's books of predictions were sold widely and were some of the best sellers of the Renaissance. And yet, problems were about to begin for astrology in the West. Astrology was dealt a big blow when it started to be rejected by astronomers as the antique worldview collapsed. Until the Renaissance, as you know, the geocentric theory, which put the Earth at the center of the universe, had not been seriously questioned. It was even more unquestionable because it had also become the official teaching of the Church. The dominating theory about the structure of the universe dated back to ancient Greece, particularly with Aristotle. In Aristotelian physics, there were several spheres, and Earth's was one of them. Above our heads were two other spheres, the sublunar realm, including the sky up to the moon, and the celestial realm beyond the moon, where stars and planets evolved. Astrology had completely embraced this model. All its calculations and principles were based on it, bound to it. But in a few decades it became apparent that Earth was just a planet among others, that there were more planets or celestial bodies than previously thought, such as the moons of Jupiter. It was proposed that maybe the Sun was at the center, as in the heliocentric theory of Copernicus, and so all the principles of astrology with its limited number of known planets, the Sun revolving around the Earth, and stars forming constellations were called into question. These constellations were just our perception from where we stand, and in fact the stars in the same constellation could be at very different distances from us. They appeared grouped only because they are in the same sector of the sky. This realization led more and more astronomers to stop taking astrology seriously, because they knew that all its assumptions since antiquity no longer held true. It doesn't mean the concept of astrology was fully rejected yet. That is to say, the idea that stars and planets influence real life. The problem was the modern realization that the astrological system, which had been in use for so long, was built on a description that was no longer scientifically accurate, a model that could no longer be associated with astronomy. The separation of the two fields did not happen quickly, though. It took place in stages during the 17th and 18th centuries, possibly because many astronomers were also astrologers. I'm not talking about obscure scholars, but people like Galileo, Kepler, Tycho Brahe, who are some of the most prominent astronomers of the Renaissance, the early modern period, and even of history. People who made major discoveries also practiced astrology. Another possible reason is that when this revolution, the conception of the universe, happened, it was very destabilizing. It transformed the vision of the world from a finite, familiar model that placed Earth and mankind at the center into one with unprecise limits and unprecise boundaries. Where did this immensity end, if it did? Humans found themselves traveling in space on a planet that was no different from other planets. Not a comforting thought. So there was probably reluctance to abandon the old Aristotelian model. And until the 18th century, astrology was not heavily criticized or rejected outside of universities, because in universities it was now considered out of place, and in stages it was ousted. This meant that, unlike previous centuries, there was no longer much intellectual investment put into astrology, and the system was not reinvented. It could have been conceivable that around the Copernican revolution, astrology would have reset itself. Around the world, from China to Mesoamerica, there had been different takes on astrology, different approaches to it. The basic belief or assumption is that celestial objects interfere with terrestrial life, not that there are fixed zodiac signs or that every planet has a particular fixed influence. So astrology could have reinvented itself to absorb all this new information about the distances and nature of celestial objects and the many new planets discovered, along with the realization that the sun was a star among many. But this only partially happened and away from universities and the academic scholarly world, partially because, as I mentioned, a few other planets were added and attributed an influence, but the rest of the system was left unchanged or only marginally adapted. This reinvention probably did not happen because times had changed too. Analogical reasoning was no longer accepted as knowledge in a scientific sense of fact-based, proven knowledge, because astrology could not explain why or how it worked, and because it could not show statistical proof of efficacy. It had lost its academic credibility. From the 18th century to our day, there is no shortage of critiques that point to the absence of proof. The fact that astrology utilizes calculations or principles of astronomy that once were astronomically correct, but not anymore, or that it doesn't take into account many celestial bodies, is often highlighted. Astrology offers a very simplified version of space, where only nearby objects that are visible and arbitrary constellations are considered. Yet the expulsion of astrology from universities and mainstream science did not make it disappear. Astrology flew under the radar during the 19th century. It was still there, but with little representation in literature or the media. Since the 20th century, it has come back and forth in popular culture, with horoscopes in the press and probably more astrologers than ever. Even though nowadays they no longer do any astronomical calculations. They use ephemerides in books or ready-to-use software to make their predictions. The fact that astrology survived so well suggests that maybe it is not about scientific or rational demonstration of its merits. Why do people still believe, or at least like to have fun and seek advice with astrology? Maybe part of it is because it is comforting, not just because it offers predictions and explanations about what happens in our lives, but also because of the world view it is built on. Astrology brings us to a finite world, a projection in which there is a limited number of bodies traveling in a space confined to a few constellations. A big space, but one that can be grasped and become familiar with. There are rules that can be learned or understood. This is much more reassuring and familiar than thinking of a limitless space with billions of bodies and the absurdity of living on one of them, traveling at thousands of miles per hour in space, somewhere in the margins of a galaxy. Modern astronomy can be fascinating, but also anxiety-inducing. This could be said of modern science and technology in general, too. So there is probably something appealing in astronomy as a system. It is closed. It claims to make sense of things that seem to happen randomly. Psychologically, it takes what looks like chaos and replaces it with order and meaning. Even more so when it takes individual responsibility away from people, at least for a part, by suggesting that what happens to them and how they feel is due to external influences. Another appeal of astrology is that it is individualized somewhat. The horoscope published in a magazine, not that much. But birth charts also provide a unique astrological profile to each person. It tells you at the same time that you are unique and that you belong to something. Maybe it's not a coincidence that astrology is growing hand in hand with the wellness industry. Another hypothesis is that it is a reflection of anxiety in society. Astrology experienced a spike in popularity in the 1970s. There seems to be another one now. This could be linked to a higher share of the population looking for answers and at the same time waiting to find comfort in a world view that has been around for a long time, so that people don't even question it that much. Even fans of astrology generally don't know or think much about where the zodiac comes from, how it was put in place, by whom. And indeed, as we have seen tonight, it is very old, more than 2,000 years old. I hope this historical tour interested you and that you could learn a few things. We've come to the end of our little journey. Now you can let go and sleep. Or, if you are not sleepy yet, you may pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.